if you've weathered the storm this long, just hold out a little longer. We're getting there. Welcome back to Landline Now. We have been waiting and waiting and waiting for the freight market to turn around, and there are signs now that it's finally happening. Motive recently came out with its Q1 Economic Outlook report, and it's full of optimism. Joining us to break it down is Hamish Woodrow. He is the Director of Data Analytics at Motive. Hamish, thanks for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me on.
We got a lot to get to here, and before we get to the data here that's kind of dictating some of the optimism that we're seeing and hearing out there, can we talk a bit about how you come up with that data that kind of, again, dictates our mood? I know Motive is looking at a number of indicators to come up with these assessments, obviously. What specifically are you looking at? What specifically, I guess, is really standing out to you right now?
Yeah, sure. So a little bit on how we come about on the report. So we track more than 1 million devices moving around North America, and through that data, what we really are looking at is activity, especially within the trucking market. What does activity look like? So we're looking at ports. How many trucks are visiting ports? We're looking at the top 50 retailers in big box retailers in the U.S. and looking at how many deliveries are happening at their warehouses. And then that creates our retail index. And we're also now looking a lot at what's happening in the US-Mexico border, how like the land ports of Laredo are faring in terms of traffic that we're seeing. So we're looking at a lot of this activity data combined with more than 300,000 geofences that we look at this entry and exits data, covering a good proportion of trucks moving in North America to come up with insights. And as you mentioned, really, we're pretty positive with where 2025 is going to go. There's a lot of volatility, and I think everybody will talk about it over the coming months. A lot of uncertainty, but there's definitely a positive trends, especially on the fundamental sides for the trucking sector.
Yeah, let's get into, again, kind of this data here that you've compiled here along with your colleagues. You mentioned there the big box retail index kind of looks at the conditions for retail stores out there. As we look forward, we also have to look back, obviously. Q4 obviously included the holiday season. As we move through Q1 here, it looks like from all the indicators out there and including your report, it looks like the big box retail stores are in a really good place right now, which can often lead to good things for the trucking industry. What specifically are you seeing out there, I guess, from Q4 and what it looks like now as we, again, kind of move through Q1?
Yeah, and the big box retailers, especially those with large brick and mortar facilities, had a really strong end of the quarter in Q4. So overall, big box retail index was up 3.8%. That covers basically the top 50 online plus in-store shops in North America. And we're looking at the deliveries going into their warehouses. So we're really looking at that middle part of the supply chain, what's happening in the inventory. So before it hits the stores, what are the purchasing managers, logistics managers planning that they're going to need to hit demand? And we saw a really strong trend, especially in certain segments. So home improvement was up 47%. And then we also saw apparel, goods, and electronics stores having a plus 40% as well, year over year increase. Now, part of the increase is it's like a tale of two stories. It's kind of where were we last year? And 2023 was not a strong year for a lot of inventory coming in. It's a slightly different situation just now. What we see is retailers have historically low inventory to sales ratios. So they're actually keeping relatively low inventories. So that meant that they could bring in a lot more inventory during this period of time. And I think also with looming risks coming, especially in that Q1 period with change of administrations, possible tariffs looming, as well as at that time when these purchasing managers were making the decision, possible strikes on the East Coast ports again, then there was an incentive, especially for some of those retailers, to bring in goods beforehand. So especially those with sourcing a lot of goods from China or those with sort of longer lead times or where they really like require shipments coming in from ports. So you'll see that a lot in the data, and that's what we're seeing. So overall, though, entering into Q1, we've seen a really positive trend on the retailer side, and I think that's also been confirmed by kind of the retail strength, the consumer strength continuing to perform strongly. You know, it's still what we expect is moderate growth. We're not expecting explosive growth, but everything's telling us that retailers are still expecting demand to come through into Q1 and continuing up their purchasing.
You mentioned a number of those challenges that are kind of lurking out there, and obviously retailers were prepping ahead of time. We saw some of that in Q4, which you kind of spoke about there. The challenges, though, that exist now in Q1, as we kind of move through the year, you expect moderate growth. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen with any number of these things out there, but is there concern amongst retailers that some of this could be cooled down a little bit, just based on all that stuff that's swirling around out there?
I think that there's always fear, and I think the reality of the situation for retailers over the last 5 to 6 years, if you've kind of lived in a constant mode of volatility and firefighting, you know, especially when it comes to those handling the logistics sides of those businesses. And so, we've seen everything from, 2022, fuel prices going up to $5.70. We've seen, obviously, the freight market crash that has, to a certain extent, helped retailers because there's been overcapacity and therefore it's been very attractive to do just-in-time shipping and just really bring down your lead times because there was a lot of availability both on the ocean side as well as the trucking side. And we're in a slightly different picture now. So there's different issues coming up now. And I think one of the things that's important is and what we're finding out from talking to different individuals is that you can't plan for all the events. And, every even week here seems to be a different sort of possible thing that may be an existential threat to your business. The reality is you can't plan in those environments. What you can plan for is understand that the envelope of outcomes is wider. There are riskier events, and we've even seen that on the global scale of different ports closing, different locations closing. Those things can really impact your business. So diversification is really key. You can't be relying and even most retailers learned this in 2017. Huge indexing on certain locations in the world for sourcing most of your goods led to a lot of impact on businesses and the costs. And same is being seen in the trucking sector. Those that really relied on East Coast ports last year, had a lot of exposure to businesses as those ports shut down. We're in an environment that will continue as it has done in the last few years of being highly volatile, with things changing month to month. And therefore it's impossible for anybody to plan that except to plan for increased risk in your business and having diversification in there.
One of the kind of ongoing stories over the past several months and really a couple years now is this boom in freight at the southern border, which we've talked about on the show. We may have talked about it with you actually, but your report here looks at the numbers, looks at the data, and essentially expects that trend to continue for the foreseeable future, even despite the threat of tariffs that are out there right now. What are you seeing there at the southern border? It really is something to see this boom.
Yeah.
I mean, is it surprising you at all? What's your take on what you're seeing there?
No, and just to give you an idea, we're seeing close to 30%, 28.5% increase year over year in the traffic that came through just the Laredo, one of the biggest ports of entry, with about 40% of goods coming in by truck. Huge volumes of increase. We see that specifically in kind of two main categories, like vehicles, as well as sort of manufactured good, heavy duty manufactured equipment, and as well as computer parts, seeing a huge year-over-year growth. And in a way, it's not surprising. The amount of foreign direct investment that has gone in really since the 2018s, 2019s into Mexico in establishing manufacturing facilities, in establishing distribution centers, etc. These are essentially coming online and starting to fuel this growth trend. And this is part of the diversification strategy that really existed in 2017. I think if we look at Mexico overall, since 2018, they've grown about 19% in terms of total trade with the US. I think if you look at China, it's gone down 18% during the same period of time. And so, like the reality of the market is that the goods are moving elsewhere, and Mexico is not the only one to benefit. We've seen that elsewhere. You'll see many countries in Southeast Asia seeing growth as well in trade, as well as the likes of Colombia as well, bringing goods to the U.S. So we've seen more diversification. Mexico's definitely benefited, and what we're seeing now, and the reason we expect it to continue, is a huge amount of investment has gone into manufacturing centers, and these, as they come online, will continue to provide that sort of tailwind to the industry of more goods coming from south of the border.
Um, by comparison, what we're seeing at the northern border, it's really kind of leveled off and actually
Yeah.
decreased. Anything of note there? Is it something to be concerned about, or is it just kind of offset by the growth that we've seen at the southern border?
Yeah, Canada's an interesting one. I think, in Q4 we saw about 4% less 4.7% less truck crossings than we did see in the previous years. But you really like zoom out and look at the last 5, 6 years, you just see flatness in terms of there's obviously certain types of goods that oil, etc., that also move across borders, but without trucks. The trucking market specifically has been very, very flat in terms of trade. It's almost a non-story in terms of for the trucking sector. I'm not sure actually on the truck on the Canada side. I think it doesn't provide the same incentives as we've seen in growth south of the border, and I don't see any sort of positive trends that would change the dynamic over the next couple of years. I think the reality is you will continue to see, I think, the growth coming from south of the border. I think then you'll start to see more and more destinations also come online and providing inputs to the US. And going back to that whole thing of volatility, having a distributed like a supply chain where you're diversified in different countries, that also one of which has a common land boundary with the US, especially in a market where ocean freight is very volatile in prices as well as in terms of lead times at the moment. These provide also strategic advantages for businesses as well.
Another thing that stood out to me in this report, you noted, and this is important, I think, that fewer carriers exited the market in the fourth quarter of 2024. So we're seeing some equilibrium beginning to take shape there. Based on that metric, the number of carriers entering and exit the market, what can we read into that? And I think it kind of all folds into this conversation about us turning a corner finally. But what does that tell you when you see that information there?
Yeah. So 2024 was overall a year where I'd say we were a bit in the doldrums. Like we were just like hanging around in this sort of state of equilibrium where like the industry was still contracting to a certain extent, but at a much slower rate than we'd seen kind of in the previous months. And that came true in Q4, where we saw about 3,800 carriers exit the market on a net basis. And that was about a 67% decrease year over year. So it's a huge reduction from where we were in 2023. And we're kind of at the point that we're treading water and waiting for like rate improvements. Now, what we saw already in the first month of this year is a really positive trend to new carrier growth. So we saw about 8,800 carriers set up in January. Really positive trend to new carrier growth starting out in the year. And we generally see that as a seasonal trend as well, but it's above even what we saw in 2023 and 2024. So there's some positive trends with new carrier entrants. I think the economic environment that drove so many carriers out is kind of moving away, and we'll start to see rates go up, progressively through, I think, this first half of the year. I actually think the biggest positive trend we'll see is in the back end of the year as we move into many industries' peak seasons. We've just reduced, there's more than 50,000 companies that have gone out of business during this period of time. It's been a lot of hurt for the industry. But we've reached that point that the capacity, and assuming US stays strong, demand stays strong, the trucking sector has a lot of potential to grow very strongly in the back end of this year.
Yeah, the cautious optimism is kind of transitioning slowly into just regular old optimism here,
Yeah.
obviously, as you point out, and I think others have as well. It's going to be kind of a slow climb. It's going to take some time, but by the end of this year, we should see quite a bit of growth there. With that in mind, any advice for people out there who are listening to this, who are thinking, I want to take advantage of this. I want to make sure that I'm doing everything I can that will enable me to, be profitable this year. What would you say to those folks out there?
Yeah. So, what history tells us when we look at this is the carriers that are operating just now and have really driven their efficiency and have survived, in essence, one of the toughest periods the industry's had in living memory. If you are able to maintain your efficiency through the next period and reinvest in your businesses, especially with the likelihood that interest rates will at least remain flat or even decrease, you have the potential to outperform the rest of your peers. This is the period that the next set of great enterprise companies are built. And you will see huge growth within certain businesses. But the key, and this isn't just within the trucking sector, this has happened if you look in the oil and gas sector, if you look at many industries that are impacted by cyclical changes, if you're able to maintain your like all the efficiencies you've eked out of your businesses to get as much of the margin and just survive through this period, if you can maintain that through this next period and not allow bloat to come into your system and continue to maintain visibility, you'll really see this outperformance, and you'll see huge growth in companies. And I think we're expecting a lot, especially with tech, where tech is right now. Companies that are especially tech forward and can grow without increasing massively their operating costs and maintaining the efficiency of the business. Those companies that figure out how to scale efficiently, you'll see some great companies come out of this period. And so, like a recommendation is for everybody is as much as when the temptation is when rates start to go up, is to start spending in other areas and loosening the belt a little bit. It's important if you want to think about the long term of your business is to really use this period to grow and reinvest as much as possible in your business, and then you will definitely reap the rewards come a few years down the line.
Yeah, if you've weathered the storm this long, just hold out a little longer. We're getting there. Hey, Hamish, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you real quickly about the West Coast, California in particular, which recently walked away from its ambitious, controversial advanced clean fleets rules. It really does remove a barrier for a lot of carriers out there who are worried about meeting those requirements. Are you sensing relief from those you speak with about, how this would have affected them? What does it do for the California market in general as well?
Yeah, I've heard general optimism or like positivity around it. I think it's a good thing that ultimately, it's been pushed back and scrapped overall. I think, it would distort a lot the market. I think that's the feedback we're getting. It would make it very hard sometimes to operating. It would, some of the regulations would have been really tough to achieve and would have made it much tougher for certain fleets to operate in California. And so I think in general, especially in the environment where the industry isn't doing super well right now and is really waiting for positivity, it would have been something that would have kind of hurt growth. And I actually think organically you'll actually see a lot of fleets move to fulfill, I guess, the sentiment behind the bill. But you're already seeing it like in most metropolitan areas with medium duty vehicles where there's a large transition and it's on a cost basis as you replace fleets, and it's a business decision. I think we'll continue to see that happen. But overall, there's a lot of positivity coming from, I'd say, not the move away from enforcing this over this time period.
Positivity. I mean, I got to say, after the last few years, it's nice that we've got
I
some
know.
positive things happening finally that we can talk about and smile about a
Yeah.
little bit and kind of breathe a sigh of relief for sure. Hamish, I know you're going to continue keeping an eye on all these things, and we'll certainly reach out to you again and bother you when the next QT report comes out and anything else that you're working on. We appreciate your work and appreciate you coming on the show and speaking with us.
No, thank you very much, Joe.